Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another EGroup weekly webinar. This week, we're going to be focusing on how to accelerate your VDI environment with Nutanix and NVIDIA, right? So a great combination, really put together a strong platform and strong experience for the end user. So let's go ahead. We've got 30 minutes. Let's go ahead and jump right in. I realized I didn't have an introduction slide on myself, so I will go ahead and give you that. Mike Dent with EGroup. I'm the Director of Data Center Architecture. So my team leads the professional services side of EGroup, focusing on your data center, really the four walls, hybrid cloud, everything that kind of falls in between that section, right? We're really looking at emerging technologies, simplifying the environment for customers, and really benefiting the organization from a simple and elegant mindset with solutions that just make sense. A little bit about EGroup for those that are just joining us that don't know about us. We founded in 1999, so we celebrated our 21st year, 22nd year now, if math strikes me. We've been doing 2 decades of really delivering successful outcomes across a variety of silos for our customers. We are privately owned, debt-free business. It's something we are very proud of, that we can maintain that. National, international delivery experience. You know, we've been able to go worldwide for some of our stuff, really being able to see a vast kind of experience of customers and what we've been able to deploy, and really see a variety of really good outcomes for customers. Like I said, we go against many different silos. We don't focus in a specific vertical, legal, higher ed, manufacturing, logistics, et cetera, et cetera. So a little bit about eGroup. We're made up of 3 groups: data center architecture, cloud services, and our managed services. So let's get into the topic of today, why we're here, why NVIDIA and Nutanix, right? Really, it's about VDI. It's about the experience of VDI. It's about making sure that what we're delivering to our customers is something that, and by customers, let me just preface that I also mean end users in many cases. VDI can be expensive. VDI can be cumbersome and complex. So why does VDI fail, right? And when we kind of sit down and look at it, a lot of times it comes back to poor infrastructure and planning, right? Thinking you can do something for VDI, thinking that your server virtualization stack can provide the same experience for VDI users is sometimes a faulty idea. You know, being able to scale your VDI environment is tough. Scaling it without incurring massive expense is also tough. So there's a high cost in deploying and maintaining an infrastructure for VDI. You see this quote right here: the storage accounts for 40 to 60% of the total cost per desktop. I'm not sure that's true necessarily anymore. Storage is kind of become a table stake, right? We can do storage pretty easily, somewhat cheap, but the compute and memory are really the two that are starting to hit home for a lot of people, that if you want to do VDI, it can cost a decent amount of money. And we also have complex stack management, right? When you look at this, you've got, if you're a 3-tier customer still, or even have moved into hyper-converged, there's many different management points, many different touch points that you've got to be able to handle for the environment to work and work well. So it's one of these things that when we look at these 3 scenarios, VDI sometimes from the onset is doomed to fail, right? Because when you look at these, I can stand up hardware, we can stand up infrastructure, we can do networking. But one thing that we forget about is the experience. That it's not just standing up an environment and throwing it over to our end users and saying, here, have at it, right? This is going to be great for you. So it's not as simple as we want it to be, right? We have to balance experience versus scale. How do I make sure that the end user experience, so that my customer's experience is no different than if they were working on a desktop, or no different than working kind of in an environment that they don't worry about that UI, they don't worry about latency, they don't worry about their experience, because it's acceptable to them. But how do we do that versus scale, and needing to scale quickly to handle those end users? It's a decent amount of infrastructure, no matter what VDI solution you're looking at, whether it's Horizon View, Citrix virtual desktops, Nutanix Frame, insert a lot of these, whatever VDI provider you want here. There's typically a decent amount of infrastructure required. Now, we are seeing a lot of migrations to the cloud from a management or control plane perspective, but there's still a lot of hardware that goes with these things. Deployment time takes a little bit. It's not as easy as just pushing a button in AWS or Microsoft Azure and our stuff spins up, right? We've got to take the time to build out our environment correctly. And this is whether you're in a hybrid scenario where you've got some on-prem and some in the cloud, or even some mostly in the cloud, right? We have to think about how we handle our networking, how we handle master image customization. The deployment time for VDI is not necessarily as quick as we want it to. And finally, the speed, right? How do you ensure that getting from point A to point V is really something that you can do in a fashion that does not take months to years to get there, right? So you're typically working with multiple teams. It's hard to scale up fast. And then, of course, you add in DR. How can I ensure that my environment, in a scenario where I have to have a failure, can I quickly get my users back up and running? So I kind of polled my team this week about, what are some of the top VDI mistakes we typically see, right? And you can probably come up with a list of your own. But these are some of the ones that we kind of put together from an end user perspective of what we see working across different customers. The first one, not understanding user and workloads, right? Not understanding what your users are actually doing inside a VDI session. A lot of people just think, hey, they're just web browsing, they're just using Outlook, they're not doing much. But when you sit down and look at what they're actually doing, that's their lifeblood from an 8 to 5 perspective, right? They're always in this VDI session. So saying that, oh, they're just doing web browsing or Outlook or this or that takes away from what they're actually doing. The second one here is one we see a lot these days, is people with their migrations from Windows 7 to Windows 10 really just assume that Windows 10 I could get by with what I had that I was using for Windows 7 and not have any issues. This is a big one we see where there's just this assumption that, hey, it was working fine for Windows 7, I upgraded to Windows 10, and now my users are screaming at me. Happens a lot. This third one, we're not really going to cover this in our topic today, but profile management. Popularity of Office 365 and how email works now has put a large strain, not just on profile management, but on the end user experience. So profile management's another one. We could probably dedicate a whole topic to that, just on how we need to handle profile management for VDI. The fourth one here, pilot testers. This is a one that you can probably imagine you see this all the time. I'm going to pilot a new environment. I'm going to have my IT group do it because they're standard users. But then you all of a sudden realize that they're not standard users. They do things differently than potentially an end user would. So again, all of these things kind of come down to the last one, right? Is not optimizing the image. How do we look at this? How do we make sure that the image is fully optimized for what our users are doing, the workloads they're running, and everything that goes with that? So the key point that I think as we get into this session and why I've chose the topic of Nutanix and NVIDIA for your VDI environment is graphics have changed over the course of the last 5, 7, 10 years, really, right? If we look at these, from Windows XP to Windows 7 to Windows 10, graphics have really taken over what the operating system's doing, and not just the operating system, but the applications themselves. I thought this was a very interesting graphic from a case study that Nutanix and NVIDIA did, that when we look at the GPU demands, the increase from Windows 7 to Windows 10, Microsoft Outlook uses the GPU 85% more in Windows 10 than it did in Windows 7. So again, based on on a false assumption of, what I could do with Windows 7, I can probably get away with Windows 10. That is not going to hold true. We look at some of these, Excel, PowerPoint, things are using the GPU more for graphics heavier components, right? And so again, how are we keeping pace with that? We can't just say, hey, we're going to throw more hardware at it to handle this, because that's not a great kind of method going forward. It's a bad strategy. You're going to have to scale much further than you want to. And again, costs are going to be insane for how we get to a stable environment that provides that end user experience. So why Nutanix for VDI? And again, I can kind of go sideways into an entire session on why Nutanix in general, but why Nutanix for VDI? Right? So a couple topics really around why Nutanix for VDI. Simple, scalable, flexible, right? It's a simple deployment, right? Simple, you unbox it, you throw a couple cables to it, and we can get a cluster up and running in almost no time. It takes the complexity of standing up a 3-tier environment or more complex environments out the window. It's infinitely scalable. I can start with my 3 nodes. When I need to, I can add a 4th, I can add a 5th, I can add a 6th, and so forth. But I can also add across generations of hardware. I can also add different generations or different models of hardware, right? So I can go from maybe a more compute dense node type to a more storage dense node type in the same cluster. I can go from a G5 to a G6 to a G7. Those are going to be different models of Nutanix. I can have those in the same cluster. So I'm not always having to do massive refreshes. So simple, scalable, and very flexible. I can choose my hardware vendor. If you're a Cisco shop, great. If you're a Dell shop, great. If you're an HPE shop, great. Nutanix allows you to bring your hardware vendor to the scenario, right? Bring who you want to work with, and Nutanix will provide the software to run on top of that. Now, Nutanix also has their own branded hardware line, NX, which is based on Supermicro. But again, the flexibility of choosing what you want. Eliminating performance concerns with data locality and shadow clones. Data locality is a key tenet of the Nutanix platform, meaning that if I'm a VM running on a specific node, all of my data lives on that node. And I'll touch on this on the next slide about data locality and shadow clones. But data locality really drives home the performance and capabilities of Nutanix when all of my data remains local. There is no network latency. There's no fiber channel latency. I'm not having to go back and forth between a storage array or any other components in the middle that drive my data. Everything stays with me. Nutanix is also hypervisor agnostic. So you can choose your workload hypervisor. You know, we've got a lot of customers that are VMware. They've made their living on VMware in the last 20 years. But now there's choices out there today. So you're not necessarily locked into VMware. You can look at the AHV hypervisor, which is Nutanix's hypervisor that comes with every node deployed. So now I have the ability to choose what hypervisor I want to run as my for the specific workloads. If I'm a Citrix VDI user, I have the choice of deploying against AHV or VMware or Hyper-V, right? So I now have the choice of what hypervisor I'm going to run that makes the most sense specifically for my workloads. And finally, one that I really like for files, really like for VDI is Nutanix Files. And that's a built-in file server on the platform itself. So I'm able to keep my users' profile data as close as possible to where they are running their workloads, where their VMs live. So the user's profile can almost live on the exact same node that the workload is running on. So my end user VDI instance can be on the same node that I have file data. So it pulls that profile data closer back to the user, and again, simplifies the operations of how that user's experience is. So jumping into the data locality real quick, and again, we could spend an entire segment just on Nutanix here, but I'm going to kind of brief through this. So data locality, you know, all the VM's data is served locally from the node that it lives on, meaning my VM's data lives on either the local SSD tier or store it, whatever storage I've got on that specific node. If I move from node A to node B, well, that data moves with it. So the latency penalty that might exist for any network type storage or fiber channel storage is gone. Everything stays local. It's all on a PCI bus, super fast, direct access, right? Now, if that VM moves, well, all my writes now occur on that new node, and the reads will be pulled from the previous nodes that my data lived on. So as VMs move around, there's a lot of shift of data that's coming and going east and west that makes sure that the data is always as close as possible to the VM that needs it. So data locality, again, key tenet of the Nutanix platform. One that's really good, one feature that's really good for VDI, especially when we're looking at VDI that's doing things like PVS or MCS with Citrix, or instant clones or linked clones for VMware, is shadow clones. And it's a feature that's built into the Nutanix platform that detects when a specific file, when a target VMDK or a target vdisk, the disk of the master image, when it's set to read only, as it would be through linked clones or things like that, and Nutanix, the Nutanix file system determines that there's multiple things trying to read. So multiple sources or multiple sources trying to read that single file. What it does then is it takes a shadow clone and copies that file, copies that vdisk or VMDK out onto each node. Again, keeping that data locality mentality right up front. Now I have, instead of my linked clones or instance clones as they're being deployed to each of my new hosts, instead of having to go back over the network to read from that master vdisk or master VMDK, it is now referencing local. So I'm able to keep all of my data locality directly on the nodes that these VMs are running on. Again, a great feature, great for performance, and allows you to quickly do recomposes or rebalances or even spin up new pools on your VDI. So why do I need a GPU, right? So first slide, or one of the early slides we touched on, was assuming that performance, what I did with Windows 7 or even earlier versions of Windows 10, I could get away without a GPU and just keep going. You know, use of the NVIDIA GPU, right? To back a VDI instances can cut CPU utilization 25% plus. And I've got a slide later that I'll show about a case study that Nutanix and NVIDIA did that kind of shows this off. But it cuts the CPU utilization down on not only on the hosts, but on the VMs themselves, right? And if we look at without a GPU, what it does, every kind of graphics call that without a GPU, that goes to the CPU, and that hits our CPU. Everything that you're doing. So if we looked at that one of those previous slides where Outlook is now using 85% more, and if you look, you know, the newer versions of Outlooks, they're becoming much more richer from a client UI perspective. All of the activities you do there are now hitting the CPU when a GPU is not involved. So again, we're able to cut our overall CPU utilization well down across all of our nodes that eliminate some of this performance penalty that we hit without a GPU. Again, comparing Windows 10 against previous versions, Windows 10, Microsoft's come out and said it, NVIDIA comes out and has said it, AMD's come out and said it. If you're a Windows 10 user, you need a GPU. This is the same. You wouldn't have a laptop or a desktop today running Windows 10 without a GPU. It would suffer performance. You know, one of the things that a GPU also provides us is the ability to have multiple different GPU cards and profiles to meet any type of workload scenario. So if I'm just a knowledge worker and I'm just doing web browsing and Outlook and some Excel, there's a specific profile that allows me to get GPU graphics memory specific for that. If I'm a hardcore professional designer and I need an 8K monitor and I'm going to do that through a VDI instance, NVIDIA has a GPU that works in a virtualized world there as well. So again, we can go from kind of the entry level type scenario to a more kind of robust. You know, and one thing to consider, the last 2 points is, you know, we have to consider the density of our users as well as migrations of VMs. NVIDIA and GPUs in general aren't new, but the functionality that have been provided by hypervisors is a little bit newer, right? So if I look at kind of the vMotion or the live migration of VMs, you know, not that it's a huge deal, but they only started providing that functionality here recently within the last couple of years. So again, we're seeing great advances in the GPU worlds with the hypervisor vendors to really make this a fully featured environment. Real briefly, how a GPU works when it's virtualized. It's no different than your physical GPU, right? A virtual GPU basically just maps a virtual GPU to the machine that needs it. You have the ability to have VMs with multiple GPUs if you need it. But again, it's passed through from the physical GPU through the hypervisor directly into the VM. So real quick on how that GPU configuration works. A quick slide on GPU performance. As you can see, higher is better. So we're shooting for the 5s. I'll just kind of let you go over some of these. But look at, I thought the interesting one was launching PowerPoint with a GPU versus non-GPU, right? We're almost at a 5.0, meaning it's perfect, almost as good as a physical, versus without a GPU, we're at a 3. It's tolerable, I can make do, right? When we look at some higher kind of content viewing, YouTube videos, right? And it's a big discrepancy. Google Maps, big discrepancy. So again, you can see having a GPU, the performance scales much better with a GPU than without a GPU on a per user experience. So something to consider about GPU licensing, it's based on concurrent user, right? So if I've got 100 users in my VDI environment, but only 60 are concurrent at any given time, great. I only need to have 60 licenses. So that's one thing to always think about. How am I going to license this? But then at the same time, NVIDIA kind of makes it a little bit muddier and offers you multiple licensing types. The second one down, Grid PC or VPC, I bolded it. Doesn't show up bold great on the slide, but it's kind of the 99% of what we see with GPU users is the Grid PC. That's what we want for users that are doing basically full desktops, and they want performance inside that desktop. They've also got what's called VApps, which is going to be more if you're just presenting apps. But we also go all the way down to the Quadro, which is, if you're a hardcore Autodesk designer and you need great performance from your professional type design, or even down to the virtual compute server for AI workloads. These GPUs provide the capabilities to add functionality and features to the end user experience, regardless of your user's workload. This slide, how do we deploy a GPU? It's pretty simple, right? Our nodes, we have to make sure that the nodes have a physical GPU in them. We deploy a license server, install the drivers on the host, install the drivers in the VMs, no different than you would a physical machine. Determine our profile, and I've got a slide on profiles here in a minute, and then release it to users. It's a pretty simple process. There's not much work that has to go into actually deploying and maintaining the GPU. I'm probably oversimplifying it a little bit, but at the same point in time, we're able to quickly deploy GPUs in our environment when we need to, and not everybody needs them. So that's the beauty of this, is we can target the users that we specifically need. Not sure how well this shows up, but the point to this slide is the fact that I can drive different profiles for different users and different workloads. As you can see, these are two different GPU cards that NVIDIA provides, a T4 and an M10. You can look at the T4 card, and for example, on a Nutanix 3155 node, which is their GPU specific nodes, I can get 4 T4 cards in a single 3155. So if I look at that T4 1B profile, for example, I can get up to 16 users per board that get a 1 gig video memory, right? And that can drive up to 4 monitors. Now, 16 users per board, you might think, well, I got a lot of VDI users, but if I've got 4 of those cards per server, that's 64 users in a single server. 64 VDI instances with the GPU backed VM on a single server. Now, if we look at the M10, which is a much more robust card, the interesting there is on a 3155 model from Nutanix, I can only get 2 of these cards installed based on the size of these cards. But if you look at those, I can also do the exact same thing. I can get 32 users per card or per board, giving me 64 total. So I have different ways to kind of model these GPUs and different ways to kind of look at hardware specs based on what my user profiles are going to look like. So why NVIDIA and why Nutanix, right? We can really lower our TCO, total cost of ownership here, right? With Nutanix, we can deploy the appropriate amount of server, storage, and networking resources that I need today to handle my environment. I'm not buying something that I'm going to grow into in the next 2 or 3 years and have to pay a large upfront cost. I can systematically expand and buy into it as needed. With NVIDIA, I can support large scale, a GPU capable environment for my end users. Again, back to that first slide. Why do VDI fail? A lot of times it's because we don't take the end user into account. This allows us to really provide a great user experience for our end users. Ease of scale, right? Again, kind of all these kind of go together, right? I can scale when I need to. I can scale because I want to or when I need to, not because I have to. I've got the ability to be a little bit more, have a foresight into what my environment's doing and say, okay, if we're going to add this 10, 15, 20 more users, I might need to add 1 node. I don't need to add another 3 or 4 or 5. I can add just what I need to do. And again, NVIDIA offloading that CPU hit to the GPUs allows me now change what CPU utilization I need to have, what hardware I need to be able to put into these environments. So I'm able to greatly scale down what I need to actually have from an environment. A quick, I've got a link down here on the bottom. I think we'll send this PowerPoint slide out. There's a link down here at the bottom. And Nutanix and NVIDIA recently just did a case study around performance of GPUs. And if you listen to the Nutanix community podcast, this was one of the recent ones they just did. that Angelo talked about was NVIDIA and Nutanix and the benefits of why these two. And this is where this session kind of gave me an idea to kind of run this session. But just looking at this, the Nutanix platform, right? We've got a couple of nodes, handful of nodes out there for the Nutanix side. We've got 2 NVIDIA Quadro RTX 8000 GPUs installed in that node. We've got client VMs were Windows 10 with 4 CPUs and 8 gigs of memory. That's the sweet spot, right? 4 CPUs and 8 gigs of memory. If you're not doing that for Windows 10, you need to take a very close look at what you're doing and see if that's something that's going to benefit you, because you will see an immediate benefit from that type of spec for Windows 10. So what Nutanix did is they tested 48 client VMs and 64 client VMs with different profiles, right? So the first one was 48 VMs running with the T42B profile, as they say, equivalent to using 2 4K monitors. And on the 64 client VMs, they used a profile that was equivalent to 1 4K display. So again, showing you different kind of results from those two. So each of the profiles gave a 1 gig and a 2 gig video RAM. So what you can see is that on the 64 and the 48 VMs, having the GPU versus not having the GPU resulted in a 31% reduction in CPU utilization for 48 VMs and a 29 or 30% for the 64 VM testing. Big difference there, right? If I look at this of what I have to now scale my hardware to, having those GPUs, it's dramatically lowering the amount of CPU utilization and thus core counts that I need to worry about having in my physical hardware. So, and the second one I find is interesting as well is it also observed a 28% reduction in latency and a modest improvement in frame rate. So they were able to give the user a 28% less reduction in latency for their user experience, right? So they were able to provide a much better user experience, a better frame rate for watching videos and other things like that, just by simply having the GPUs installed. So a couple what are our top 3 takeaways from today as we're coming up on the top of the half hour? Nutanix can scale as needed and provide ultimate performance to data locality and shadow clones, right? There's a lot more that Nutanix provides, but when we look at VDI and we look at why Nutanix for VDI, these are some of the great points, right? Back to the flexibility, back to the other items as well. But this is a great feature from Nutanix to be able to provide performance, resiliency, and simplicity across your environment. Using NVIDIA GPUs will enhance user experience to mirror laptop desktop performance. I think that's a given, right? I want my users' experience when they're working in VDI all day to be no different than if they had a laptop sitting there doing their work, or a desktop, right? We want to provide that same experience to make sure that that's not a detriment to our work. And then finally, as we saw on that last slide previously, Nutanix plus NVIDIA, improvement to users' experience. That's a given. We saw that based on reduction in latency and better frame rates, but also lower CPU requirements. When we look at these, maybe I don't need to have those dual 40-core CPUs to be able to run a decent VDI environment without GPUs. Maybe with GPUs, I can get down to a 20-core CPU, and I'm still offloading that to my GPU. Provides greater density. I can potentially get more users per node as well because of my CPU core counts with GPU, or a much better ratio of virtual CPU to VM to user. And then finally, lowering my node count. We had a customer that they thought they were going to need 15 or 20 nodes just to handle their VDI environment without CPU, and with an NVIDIA and Nutanix solution, we had 8. So again, we were able to greatly reduce what that hardware footprint was going to look like, ultimately just by having NVIDIA and Nutanix together, making it a almost perfect environment. So we're coming up on the top of the half hour. One thing that we don't want to miss, again, as we've been going through these webinars, we are doing a Valentine themed trivia next week with Nutanix. You'll see the QR code on your screen. If you've got your phone out right now, you can take a quick picture of that. Otherwise, you'll be able to get this slide deck, but don't miss out on this Valentine themed trivia. We did a Family Feud trivia, I think it was either last month or back in December. A lot of fun, right? So there's a lot of fun between EGroup and Nutanix, and we want to make this kind of an interesting and fun event for you. So don't miss out Valentine themed trivia. Would have been better if we did it Valentine's Day, but nobody probably would attend. So Top of the half hour. Questions. Let's see if we got any questions that popped into our slides today. I don't see any questions. So either people, hopefully you found this entertaining, informative. And other than that, thank you for attending today. I hope this was informative for you. Any questions, let us know. We're happy to always discuss this, and stay tuned for more Nutanix related content coming from us in the near future. So thank you very much for attending today. Hope you have a great rest of the week, and talk to you soon.